Good day, everyone, and welcome to Husqvarna's Fuel and Oil webinar. So when we consider fuels, does it really matter how long fuel is stored? And if so, does it matter how it's stored? One of the things that people don't understand is even though the gasoline that you put in your gas can and put it in your garage or in your shed and never touched it, the thought is that that's still fresh fuel and that fuel is fine. In reality, that fuel has started to break down over time, and depending on the storage of that fuel and the location of that fuel, we could have a number of problems exist that would be breaking down the fuel, even though you're not going out there and using what's in the fuel can. Fuel does break down in a number of ways, and the two most common and most significant for us in the outdoor power equipment industry is oxidized fuels and phase-separated fuels. Now, oxidized fuels can occur in fuels that are either non-ethanol or ethanol fuels. And so oxidation is a reaction with oxygen, and so this means that our fuel gets exposed to the elements. And so what happens when it breaks down? It becomes discolored, and the smell of the fuel starts to foul. And what happens in the consistency of the fuel is that it starts to form gums and tars that now will become a problem with filters, screens in the carburetor, jets, and then as it's allowed to gain access to the engine, right, this sticky, gummy material through the combustion process is now adhering to the sides of the piston. It's adhering to the components that reduce friction, like bearings, and it is also adhering to the piston rings, which now allow for the rings to stick inside the ring lands, and so you will find that you'll have problems there as well. And this top image is a great example of an oxidized fuel sample. Now, remember, once this fuel breaks down and discolors like this is going to start to stain components as well. So there will be an indicator on the tech side or even for salespeople to see a chainsaw that gets brought in with a customer, and you may notice that the purge bulb is discolored, and we'll discuss that a little later. With phase separation, this is where ethanol or the alcohol in the fuel attracts water or moisture. A couple of big things happen, and so the first one is that we reduce the octane rating and level in the fuel. Now, the other thing that happens is through this process, through phase separation, we now have an acidic, corrosive liquid in the fuel that will cause damage not only to rubber parts, but to metal parts as well. And lastly, in regards to fresh fuel, right, if you've ever heard of the light ends evaporate. And so what that means is if you think about how fuel burns, it's not the liquid that's burning, but in fact, it's the fumes or the vapors. So with fuel storage, let's start with the container, right? One of the most important things that we have to realize is we need to put fuel in a container that's rated for and designed for fuel, right? And one of the characteristics of a good fuel container is that it doesn't allow sunlight in. Now, if you've ever noticed, right, our fuel cans are color-coded. So important to note that red is for gasoline. If you think about container material, if we have a steel gas can as opposed to a plastic gas can, there are some pros and cons to those materials. And so when we look at plastic, one, it's fairly flexible, and so if there's expansion of fumes, this allows for the can to expand. This material doesn't create condensation nearly as well as a metal can. Another concern that we want to consider is the fact that if I'm going to have a can for fuel, plastic can may be better, especially in regards to consumer use, because there are some concerns safety-wise for commercial use where steel cans may be required. The other important component is that it's sealed, right? We've been talking about this quite a bit earlier, in the fact that two things break down fuel really fast. One is oxygen, and two is moisture. Part of that is we're looking for storing fuel where there's a constant or consistent temperature, right? If we have swings from hot to cold, then we're going to have condensation inside the fuel can. The problem, of course, is exposure to the elements, and heat and cold and the variation of those are going to cause a problem down the road. So we want to be aware of where and how the fuel is being stored. Obviously, heat is much worse for fuel than cold. A lot of times people want to add stabilizer to fuel, and it can preserve fuel if you do it at the start. You buy the fuel, you add the preservative, the stabilizer. When we talk about quality stabilizers, right, our branded products have been tested on our products. There are a lot of oil products, like our two-stroke oils, that have stabilizer added to them already. And make sure that you're aware of whether or not stabilizer is in your fuel mix already or not. And it's also important to make sure that if you're going to use a stabilizer, that it gets used at the beginning of the process, not later down the road. As we've said, fresh fuel is an absolute must. Fuels are blended. There is a concern that that during the summer, with the ambient temperatures being higher and greater, that fuel will be more volatile. And so what fuel companies do is they blend the fuel to be less volatile. We don't waste as much fuel that way. This helps for performance and emissions. One of the things that I haven't discussed yet is the fact that fuel, in our minds, should not be stored for more than 30 days. What happens when I get to winter? Well, in winter, we need more volatility because of the ambient temperature being cold. And so we need the fuel to have a faster vaporization rate. And so we need the blending of that fuel for the winter to change. So a lot of changes happen, right? And so with cold temperatures, we have a very difficult time with fuel atomizing. So in that regard, we also recommend that you should only buy the amount of fuel that you're going to use either in a week or 2 weeks or at most 30 days. So let's talk a little more about ethanol and ethanol additives or ethanol fuel. You know, there are pros to ethanol fuel, and I'm sure that most of you are well aware of the cons of ethanol fuel. If we separate the automotive industry from the OPE industry, there are some significant bonuses, some pros to ethanol fuel. If we could separate the ethanol from the gasoline, purely we have an environmentally safe product because it's created from plant material.